and throughout the year. And now I'd like to turn it over to Tina Dumas, Program Training Manager for Liberty Mutual Insurance, to introduce today's featured speakers. So Tina, you could just unmute yourself. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Celia. I am so excited to be here today. And on behalf of Liberty Mutual, it is my pleasure to introduce today's panel of inspiring women. Joining us from McKinsey Global Institute, I am happy to welcome Dr. Makala Krishnan, partner here in Boston, where her research focuses on various topics, including women's roles in labor markets, inclusive growth, and economic development. Makala is passionate about global gender equality and is an author of MGI's Power of Parity and Future of Women at Work reports. Next, we have Nia Mathis, Vice President, State and Local Government Affairs at Verizon. Nia shapes public policy in 22 states across New England and the Midwest, supporting Verizon's objectives. Nia has been with Verizon since 2008, where she has held several roles in the legal department. She's passionate about fostering a cultural change to ensure the benefits of evolving technology are accessible to all members of society. Our next speaker is Maura Mann. Maura is the Vice President of Nagler Group in KNF&T, where she oversees sales, recruiting, operations for their local locations in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And in this role, Maura maintains a true pulse on the business community and talent workforce. And with her work ethic and client service strategy, she is a key driver in the company's award-winning growth. And last but not least, leading today's conversation from the Mayor's Office of Women's Advancement is Alexandra Valdez. Alexandra is the Executive Director and leads her team in the office's mission to promote gender equity by empowering women and removing systemic barriers to their advancement. Alexandra is driven by her long desire to improve the lives of our youth and the communities around them. And she is also committed community activist, experienced advocate for civic participation. We are honored to have all of you here today, and I am looking forward to this conversation. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Tina. And most of all, thanks to all of our panelists and everyone who's joined us today to have such an important conversation and such a big topic to make sure that we are thinking about reopening, we are thinking about the importance of women in our workforce, and most of all, how we rethink our everyday lives and our everyday thoughts when it comes to the SheCession. I'll give a little bit of background, but I know most of this information is not surprising and it's not new to everyone who's here with us today. In early 2020, prior to the start of the pandemic, women had crossed a major employment milestone in the labor market, and that was booming. And for a few months, women outnumbered men in the US. And I'll say that again. Women outnumbered men in the US paid workforce. However, a year later, over 5 million women have lost their jobs, accounting for 55% of US unemployment. With the pandemic having disproportionately impacted women, especially women of color, with the workforce, many economists are calling this a recession or a SheCession, as we want to refer it. With the business community at a crossroads, we must take action. And as in we talk about community leaders, organizers, civic engagement, anyone in our communities who think that we can make sure that we are ending the SheCession. This event is a part of our Women's Network series. Women's Network is a club you can join. It's a place where you belong, where you'll find a diverse group of more than 3,000 and even growing women and male allies at all levels of their careers. So with that being said, I would like to make a couple other points. For a few months, right now, when it comes to the SheCession, the Mayor's Office of Women's Advancement is committed to removing systematic barriers to create economic equity for women in Boston. This pandemic has hurdle a women face today, according to our partners at the Boston Women's Workforce Council. Women in Boston make 70 and 45 cents on the dollar to their white male counterparts. Childcare needs for working families impact their capacity to be a part of the workforce. And then that's just to name a few or a couple of the big issues overarching that we are going to be covering, even speaking today as to how the SheCession has affected women in the workplace. Now, I'd like to have you all share your initial thoughts on this issue, as well as what you are seeing around women in the workforce in your industries. So I'll open it up for who wants to chime in and address the question as to what are your initial thoughts regarding this issue?
Sure. I'm happy to kick us off. Thank you for the invitation to talk about this very important issue of the SheCession. Maybe let me start by saying why we care about this issue. So it, of course, matters for women themselves. But speaking for companies, why is this an important business imperative? And what our research would suggest over the last years, not just over the last year, but over the last many years, is that investing in women in the workforce and advancing women through the workplace is not just the right thing for companies to do, it's also the smart thing for companies to do. And that's for a few different reasons. The first is that our research shows that women's representation in leadership teams is correlated with performance for companies. And we've cut that in many ways across geographies, different metrics of performance. And we find repeatedly that higher representation or more equal representation of women in leadership teams actually leads to better outcomes for companies. The second is, as we think about companies serving their customers better, as we think about companies accessing the best talent, ensuring there's a level playing field in entering the workforce and advancing through the workforce actually allows companies to both deliver better products, but also have the best talent in their workforce. And then finally, with the pandemic, it has revealed the increasing importance of resilience for companies. And what having women in the workforce allows companies to do is to build more resilient workforces. There's a variety of research, including our own, that suggests that men and women tend to apply different leadership styles. And what we want in a resilient workforce is the application of different ways of leading teams, bringing different perspectives to problems. And what all of that will mean is companies that both can grow and deliver better performance, but also deliver consistent, resilient performance. So that's why it's important to care about this issue, not just the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do. But as you've described, Alexandra, we are experiencing what many have termed as a SheCession. I think you've shared a lot of the data points associated with women's representation in the workforce itself. The good news is we're starting to see some recovery, but there are still gaps. Some research we had done in the middle of last year, so almost at the height of some of the pandemic effects, what we saw was that women had made up about 39% of the workforce globally, but had accounted for about 54% of job losses. Again, some of that has narrowed, some of that gap has narrowed since then. But there is this issue of women that have disproportionately left the workforce and how we ensure a return back. That's one part and a very important part of the SheCession issue. But I think there are a few other dynamics at play here that are really important to keep in mind. The first is, as we think about women that have not left the workforce but are in the workforce itself, their experiences in the workforce have been very different from that of men. Our surveys suggest that women are 1.5 times as likely to report mental health issues while they remain in the workforce. They are more likely to report struggling balancing household responsibilities and responsibilities in the workforce. Women are 1.5 times as likely as mothers are 1.5 times as likely as fathers to say they're doing 3 or more hours of additional childcare and household responsibilities during this time. So just the workload on women that are in the workforce and the burnout, anxiety, mental health issues associated with that are disproportionately being felt by women. So that's one additional concern. The second additional concern is the aspirations of women. So our research would suggest that about 1 in 4 women are reporting that they're considering leaving the workforce or downshifting their careers in some way, whether that's moving more to part-time, not seeking that next promotion. And so that 1 in 4 number could essentially, if that did come to fruition, it would essentially mean that all the gains we've seen over the last 5 years in terms of women's advancement in the workforce will essentially be wiped out. And so I just wanted to flag that there are myriad issues here, one part of which is women participating in the workforce at all, but then the experience of the women when they do have also been disproportionately worse relative to men, and that is something we're going to have to need to manage.
I would echo everything that Michaela said. At Verizon, we like to say that our employee workforce should be reflective of our customer base and should be reflective really of the demographics of our entire country. And that's how the best way that we can ensure that our products, our solutions, and our services best meet the needs of all of our customers and are meaningful. And if you're missing women and our input and our insights into product development, into how we speak to our customers, into how we market, into how we use products and services, if we're missing those inputs, then clearly we'd be missing the ball on what our customers need and how they use our products and services. And so I would, just to echo everything Michaela said, absolutely all true. And that's the best way we meet our customers' needs.
I agree as well. I think there are a lot of different issues covered there, all of which are meaningful, and this is really so broad. I believe sometimes it takes a big event to really push change, and I think as we'll talk about over the next hour, that is one of the bright things to come out of the pandemic, is hopefully some long-term change can be accomplished, because it's important. Women are an important part of the workforce. Diversity, equity, they won't happen unless major change happens. And we need to be having these discussions more, because it can't be something where it's a focus every once in a while, or it's a focus because it's a hot button issue right now. It has to be something that carries through for many, many years to come.
Those are all great points. I mean, when we can spend more than an hour talking about this topic and talking about the issues that every single one of you guys have aligned. Just a simple fact, I'm a huge believer, and Ian mentioned, employees should look like exactly who we're serving. They should look like and represent exactly who we are set to serve and who we are set to service. And to Michaela's point, we have to think about how we bring back women into the workforce. And we also have to think about the women who are currently in the workforce, and how we do that together, and how we do that to assure that we are doing that in an equitable way. I'll chime in to the questions, and kicking that off, I would like to ask, women and working mothers can feel like they're facing bias in the workplace. If they take advantage of flexible work hours to care for their children or family, what are some ways companies can shift this false perception to get ahead of the exhaustion and burnout that may cause women to leave an organization? Mara, if we can start with you, that would be great.
I really think it all comes down to flexibility and employers realizing the valuable contributions that these women can make, and that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, that they really have to take a look and say, is what traditionally worked really the best way to move forward? Because as a mom myself, I have to be honest, especially now working from home, do I miss rushing and trying to get into the office and dealing with an hour and a half or 2-hour commute sometimes? I really think the pandemic has caused people to take a look and say, what's important to me? What do I want my life to look like going forward? And a lot of employers don't realize it yet, but there really is a war out there for talent. And as people, especially the women who've been affected and who have maybe stepped back or stepped out of the workforce, start to re-enter, the employers that are going to be successful are going to be the people who offer options, who don't say, you need to be into the office at 8:30 a.m. or sort of the wink, wink, nudge, nudge of, oh, you're done at 5 o'clock, but if you're not still sitting at your desk at 6:30, you're not really working hard enough. I really think it comes down to the work product itself and not the traditional norms of, this is when we need to be in an office. This is what our office has to look like. This is what this type of position has to do. It's really about flexibility and options for people, and people are going to take advantage of that. And if companies aren't willing to change, I think they're going to find over the next few years that they're really going to have a hard time retaining and attracting folks.
Maura, if I could jump in, the last word you used is so important because you said people and not women, right? And I think and I think you also are seeing the silver lining in this, which I do as well. I think part of the silver lining of this grand experiment we've run over the last year is that while we've talked about the disproportionate impact on women, men have also been affected. And I think that what the pandemic has done is it's brought people's home lives into the workplace in a way that we've never had before. And so I think we have the opportunity to rethink these not just as women policies, but as people policies. And the more we start to do that, we change our nomenclature around it. We make this about all employees versus a certain group of employees. I think that will start to reduce some of the stigmas associated with flexibility. It will start to change our practices around performance management. It will make it acceptable to adopt these things and not feel like it's affecting your career in a negative way. So I do think we have the opportunity here, not just that we've run this flexibility experiment and we see that we can make it work, but also the fact that we've run it in a way that has affected both men and women. And we have the opportunity to reframe this as a people conversation versus a women conversation.
Those are all great points. I mean, when we talk about going back and we talk about the workforce, flexibility is at the top of every conversation that we are having right now. When we're thinking about going back to work and what regular looks like, it's no longer the 8 to 5, it's no longer the 9 to 5. It's more about what are companies doing and what are we doing in order to make sure that we are being flexible to ensure that we are keeping our talented employees and we are actually serving with a matter of equity and diversity when it comes to our workforce. Yeah, I see that you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, so, at Verizon, we recognize that we cannot pursue lasting gender equality if we ask women to choose between having a career and being a caregiver. And that's what the pandemic has brought full circle. So at Verizon, we're focused on not asking women to choose, and we support our employees so that they can recognize their full potential, to Michaela's point, whether you're a working dad, whether you're a working mom, or just an employee. There are so many other ways in life that we are stretching and integrating. And so this does mean allowing our employees to integrate work as a part of life and allowing employees to care for their whole self with policies and programs that respond to those needs. And as a working mom of 5, I, like many working moms and dads here today, understand the importance of that integration. So as we've said, and as we've recognized, COVID-19 has served as a catalyst for workplace and workforce transformation. And 2020 taught us that a distributed workforce can help us attract talent and build inclusive environments for all employees. So at Verizon, we launched an initiative called Work Forward. And that will help us to bring together the best aspects of remote and on-site work and provide greater flexibility to support that work-life integration. So for our over 130,000 employees, we're implementing 3 working models for home-based teams, hybrid teams, and worksite-based teams. And with Verizon Work Forward, we're leveraging employee feedback again for a long time, even preceding the pandemic. Employees have asked for more flexibility and ability to manage that integration. And by doing this and moving into this new space and taking advantage of this time to provide that flexibility, it will also increase overall employee engagement.
We have also implemented a policy where we won't be going back. I mean, you can obviously go back to the office more if you would like to, but for all of our employees at Bank W Staffing, we will be going to a hybrid model and working with each individual person. We're obviously a much smaller company than Verizon, but figuring out what works for that individual and what's going to keep them happy, keep them engaged, and give them that life balance that they're really looking for.
That's amazing. I mean, going back to the fact of flexibility and ensuring that we are doing everything very equitable. This is all great, amazing best practices that each one of your employees are doing, and I applaud you guys for that. It's something that we need to all think about across the sector as how do we do this again to look back at how to reopen in the workforce in an equitable way. I'll move on to the next question. So the pandemic has brought on so many challenges that we never thought we would face. And over the past year, millions of women have had to make the decision to downshift their careers or leave it altogether. I'd like to get your thoughts on why this is not just a personal issue for women and why it should be considered a business issue. Michaela, if I can start with you, that would be great. Oh, Michaela, I believe we can't hear.
Sorry about that. I alluded to this a little bit in my opening remarks as well, Alexandra. I think ultimately for companies, this is a business imperative, whether it comes to them thinking about how they drive performance, how they think about attracting talent, how they think about retaining talent, how they think about resilience for their organization. Ultimately, the presence of women in their workforce, as well as women in their leadership teams, supports companies on all of these dimensions. I think the pandemic has posed this added challenge where there are real issues to do with worker anxiety, worker burnout, mental health challenges. And so it becomes additionally important for companies to pay attention to these issues as they think to build a vibrant workforce for themselves. I alluded a little bit to some of the statistics for women. About 1 in 4 women from our surveys are thinking about downshifting their careers or leaving the workforce in some way. I just wanted to also highlight within that group, there are 3 particular categories of women that are almost disproportionately facing burdens. The first is senior leader women that are increasingly reporting mental health, burnout, anxiety challenges. The second is women of color, many of whom are struggling more to balance household responsibilities. And then the third group is working mothers. That 1 in 4 statistic that I described of women thinking about downshifting their careers or leaving the workforce, that 1 in 4 becomes 1 in 3 when we look at working mothers. So that's a huge segment of the population that is fundamentally rethinking their careers as a result of the experiences of the pandemic. Working mothers also about 25%. About 25% of working mothers are saying that they are feeling anxiety about impacts on their performance and what this means for how companies perceive their productivity in the workplace. And they're also, as I alluded to earlier, 1.5 times as likely as men to be working 3 hours or more on household responsibilities and childcare. So that demographic in particular of working moms is one that we really need to pay attention to as we think to address this issue. As both Maura and Nia have alluded to, the interesting thing about our experiences over the last year is that many of the issues that different categories of workers are experiencing are quite similar. Everyone is struggling with balancing care responsibilities of some kind, household responsibilities of some kind, feelings of isolation, etc. But the acuteness of those challenges for specific groups is actually quite different, and therefore requires paying specific attention to those challenges for those specific segments.
Yeah, so these deep challenges require holistic approaches to address them. But one important practical area is, a way to address some of this is on the employee benefits front. And so at Verizon, we've done several things and continue to do several things to support women in the workplace. First, we expanded our reimbursement program for backup child and elder care. So we gave our employees a stipend of up to $100 a day for child care that could be used to pay anyone, including family members or friends, to babysit, because we realized that simply extending existing child care benefits wasn't much help when child care centers were closed down or care professionals were hard to find. So more than 11,000 of our employees used that benefit. And as a result, Verizon's female employee turnover rate stayed at a record low. Another thing we did is we introduced a COVID-19 specific caregiver leave program for employees that could not continue to work for a time period as they cared for loved ones or themselves, to Michaela's point. 3, we continue to offer benefits for employees who are transitioning to part-time status. And so, that opens up flexibility and options. 4, we offer extensive on-the-job training and development programs and opportunities. We have a Women of Wireless Leadership Training Program. It's a 12-month program dedicated to helping women to find their leadership style and enhance their leadership capabilities as they move their career forward. Pay equity is huge. Verizon absolutely is committed to that men and women performing the same roles receive the same pay. And there's also policy advocacy. So Verizon has joined over 200 businesses as part of the Care Economy Business Council. And that council is pushing for reforms to caregiving in the US from a policy perspective. So we're advocating for federally funded family and medical leave, affordable childcare and elder care, and elevated wages for caregivers and caregiving workers. And in a recent, it's hopeful, in a recent address to a joint session of Congress, President Biden outlined his American Families Plan, and that did incorporate many of those policy ideas. And so if Congress ultimately advances that proposal, it could fundamentally reshape the role that women play in this country. But Verizon is definitely part of advocacy, as well as doing the things that we can from an employee benefits perspective to help our employees in particular. So at Verizon, we've identified the issue with the SheCession. We're staying laser focused on the solutions to address it and making sure we have the right support systems in place for women to thrive in their careers and at home.
We've seen a lot of changes on the employee benefits front as well, particularly around companies looking into how they can improve mental health services for employees, whether it's through an employee assistance program of some type or through other types of healthcare related programs, even if it's as simple as, I know several companies are picking up like Peloton digital memberships and things like that, just so people can feel good about themselves. I think another big trend we're seeing is people are feeling very isolated. And I think we've all heard the whole idea of Zoom burnout and things like that, that when you are working from home and in many cases also either caring for children or elder care, because we've seen a lot of investment too more in elder care services for employees, because I think that's an issue a lot of people have been talking about because of remote school, the children aspect, but there's a lot of people too, especially since a lot of elders are hesitant to go into assisted living facilities and that type of thing right now. Companies are beefing up the benefits on that front too, but also team building activities. So people feel like they're part of an organization, even if they're not necessarily in the office each and every day. We've been trying to do internally for our teams, dinners, as long as people feel comfortable being out and about socially. We did an event last week in Boston. We did one last night in Portsmouth where our teams got to get together, have a nice dinner. A lot of people haven't seen each other in over a year. We've also tried to do some events on Zoom for those that they don't feel ready to interact with other people yet. And I've been advising a lot of clients on the type of programs we've been doing because they want to implement things themselves. Because I think another important thing to come out of this is you want to keep employee morale high and not lose that whole idea of mentorship within organizations as well.
Yeah, I agree. That's certainly one of the underpinnings to Verizon's Work Forward hybrid-based model, right? So for most of us, we've demonstrated that we can be effective at our jobs from home. The type of work I do, I can be successful and effective from home, but you miss the entire part of going into the workplace. That's the socializing, and that's the morale building. It's the mentoring, it's the relationship building. That's a huge part of moving our careers forward and learning from one another. And the happenstance conversation that you'll have in the hallway. You may not schedule time for it, but you learn, you pick up information, and it helps you to grow. And so certainly as we move into this next phase of our Work Forward initiative, and we look to return to the office in a hybrid way, balancing, again, work-life integration, being able to work from home when you need to work from home, if you need, a quiet time to be able to focus, to be able to read, if you can, if you're drafting, whatever your work, your job requires, but recognizing that a huge part of being successful at what we do comes from the interaction that we get. And even if the times that you spend in the office are just to make sure you get FaceTime with your team and you're getting some of the core work done at home, but you're going into the office to have that interaction with your team, that's the beauty and the benefit of the best of both worlds. And so we absolutely echo that, and Verizon's looking forward to that in our next part of this journey with Work Forward.
Nia and Maura, just building on what you said, if 2020 was the experiment around actually working remotely, I think 2021 and 2022 is how do we get this model, how do we optimize this model, right? If especially this is going to be the model that sticks. And I think both of you are alluding to some really good best practices, as well as next horizon challenges around how do we ensure performance management is done effectively? How do we measure productivity in a flexible workforce effectively? How do we ensure mentorship, a sense of connectivity, building an organizational culture in a remote or hybrid workplace? I think you also alluded a little bit to this idea of you could have a hybrid workforce, right? Meaning that there are certain people that are hybrid, certain people on-site, certain people off-site, and how do you manage that effectively? So I think 2021 and 2022 are really going to be our experiments along those dimensions. I think there's two other things for companies to also think about in this next horizon. One is, as we think about rehiring, how do we ensure equitable rehiring and apply a gender lens to our return back as we think about building back the workforce. And then I think the second, which we haven't quite talked about, but has been a trend that COVID has accelerated, has to do with the future of work. So many companies have invested in automation, digitization at a scale that we thought would happen over the next 10 years has again been substantially accelerated. And I think one implication that does have for women in the workforce is as companies think about reskilling the programs, as they think about redeploying workers to different tasks, ensuring that there's a gender lens to those practices so that the gap doesn't widen and that women are as well equipped as men to enter this new world of work, I think is again a different kind of challenge that was in place pre-pandemic, but has been accelerated by some of the automation adoption we've seen over the last year.
That's a really good point. And I'm going off of that point, Michaela, I just want to dive in a little bit more, specifically to the question that women in the workplace, right? In the study done by McKinsey and analyzes that as the most of the world has shifted to working from home, women are feeling pressured to always be on and always available. And women in senior positions can feel like they have to work more to prove to their competence against their counterparts. Women were 1.5 more likely to leave the workforce or take lower positions than men because of COVID-19. Can you explain a little bit more on this issue and the lasting effects it could have on women representation in senior level positions, and what actions can be taken to help reverse this?
Yeah, absolutely. I can start, and I'm sure Nia and Maura also have ideas from their organizations. If you remember, we've talked a lot about the impacts on women, but I described there's three groups of women that are most substantially affected: senior women, working mothers, and women of color. So looking at senior women in particular, what we see is higher rates of reporting mental health challenges and increased considerations of downshifting their careers. So not asking for that next promotion, working fewer hours. So substantial impacts in terms of all the gains we've seen on advancing women. There's a potential that all of that could be affected and regressed, frankly, as a result of the experiences over the last year. In terms of what companies can do to manage this, I think it goes back to the idea of flexibility and really integrating flexibility into our work practices. I think right now I worry a little bit that we're in this middle ground where on the one hand, we meaning society or companies overall, but in this middle ground where we have implemented flexible policies in the sense that we're allowing workers to work from home, but that has come with challenges in terms of managing this work and life boundary, right? So women in general, even pre-pandemic, were reporting concerns about needing to be on 24/7, and that being one of the reasons they don't aspire for leadership positions. And that's become even more acute in this world that we're all on Zoom all the time and our work lives are permeating our home lives. Things like, that half an hour commute, while challenging, also did create this boundary between the time you were in the workplace and the time you were at home. And that boundary has completely disappeared. And so I think we really need to rethink how we implement that word flexibility. I think flexibility needs to still come with boundaries of some kind. I think secondly, as we think about managing or assessing the performance, I've mentioned this a few times, but assessing the performance of our workforce, we can't measure performance now just in terms of hours that people are putting in place in the workplace or face time. We need to be measuring it in terms of output, in terms of productivity of a worker. In some cases, we may need to reassess things like timelines and of project deliverables, right? So I think there just needs to be a fundamentally different look at both how we implement flexibility as well as how we implement performance management. And a lot of that is going to come with investments in manager training. Our research repeatedly suggests that the experience of workers in the workplace is certainly influenced by what senior management is doing, but more immediately it's influenced by their immediate managers, right? And so the role of middle managers in driving this change is really important, and we need to equip managers with the right tools to be able to support their employees in this transitioning time that we're in.
So I'd say yes. So from a hiring and promotion practice perspective, we can all be mindful that we apply consistent standards in that process. And so men tend to be assessed based on their potential, whereas women tend to be assessed based on their past performance. And so having one objective standard for evaluating potential will be critical in the advancement, continued advancement of women in the workplace. But Verizon does a number of things in terms of programs and policies to value and support employees in their career growth. One is tuition assistance. So we have a generous tuition assistance program to help our employees to go after their higher education studies, along that line of upskilling. We have a culture of continuous learning that's supported by curated content and learning opportunities that are available to all employees through our learning portal. We have a partnership with Harvard with just excellent content to make sure that our employees are upskilling for the future and keeping pace with our evolving business needs. We also lift up leaders by investing in an array of formal and informal development opportunities and programs to strengthen our employees' leadership capabilities. And we have dedicated programs to strengthen the representation of women and people of color in leadership within Verizon. So one example is our Women of the World program. It's a 12-month career development program. Participants, meet with other women in support groups to help one another and share career tips and sort of be a support group to one another. But they're also learning from other leaders within Verizon and the larger context of just women leaders that are out there about how to develop their leadership style, about how to gain new skills, about how to succeed in a digital environment, and about how to manage their own personal and professional development. And Verizon also supports employee resource groups. So we have 10 of them, and these groups foster inclusive practices across the company. So our Women's Association of Verizon Employees is another way that we make sure that we're giving a voice to women and environments that are supportive. Because undergirding all of that is our belief that diversity and inclusion is how we achieve success. And we say it a lot, it's more than the right thing to do. It is a business imperative and it's our competitive advantage.
I actually have more women leaders working for me than men, which is nice. Yay. And our organization has been very supportive of women leaders. That said, as a staffing and recruiting firm, we're dealing with all different types of employers. And I definitely see the observation about women being judged on past performance versus potential. And one thing that I work with my teams as they're speaking and interviewing candidates on is getting women to realize their value in the marketplace. As somebody who interviews folks day in, day out, every day, it's fascinating to me the lack of self-esteem or self-worth that some women have. And I think from a business perspective, all companies need to invest in coaching to help women ask for what they want and feel confident going after opportunities. I find that, and I know that there's statistics out there that show this too, that women will look at a job description and say, oh, I'm not really qualified for this because they're looking to check every box, versus a man who's willing to look at a job description with 25 points and say, well, I have 2 of these, I'm going to give it a shot. Of women having that same oomph to say, you know what, I can do this job. I know I have the ability, I'm going to go for it. And being able to articulate that too, of saying, this is why I'm a fit for that. So I'd love to see more programs in place in companies to really encourage women to find their voice and go after the opportunities that they want and that they are qualified for.
Mara, you are speaking to the choir. You are preaching, and I agree with you. I'm guilty of it myself. I mean, there are times that I would look at a job description and I automatically would say, I'm not qualified, or this is too much, or I don't think I can do this. Right away, I will knock myself down, thinking that just because it said so in the job description, that I wasn't going to be able to accomplish it or do it. But thank you so much for bringing that to that point. And I'll love to lead us into questions from our audience. We are having such an amazing and engaged conversation. There are so many questions coming in, but I'll start with this one. If your company is not addressing these burnouts and flexibility issues as we start to come back, any advice on how to address and advocate for them without having a negative perception on your work ethic? Opening the floor, and whoever wants to take this one.
Maybe I can start. I think the first step is actually to measure it. So maybe this is because I'm a researcher at heart, but I think, frankly, you can't manage what you don't measure. And we have, for example, run pulse surveys, and I know a lot of organizations have done this during the pandemic every 2 weeks to understand how employees are feeling. And I think just having that data can go a long way in saying there is an issue, right? Actually recognizing that this is not an anecdote, there is a real issue that needs to be managed. I think the second is, my own diagnosis of this issue is that what we put under mental health actually, there are a variety of different manifestations of that among different employee groups. So for example, when we've talked to young employees, their challenge is really the sense of isolation and not feeling connected to an organization. This is especially true as companies start to open up and hire new talent. Many new employees have never met in person another fellow employee, right? So I think for younger talent, oftentimes the challenge is one of how do you ensure greater connection to the organization? I think then when we start to think about working mothers, as I said, a lot of that is around the challenge of balancing household responsibilities with responsibilities in the workplace, so on and so forth. So I think that understanding how these issues actually manifest differently by groups is quite important. And then I think the third is thinking about the set of resources that companies can put in place to address mental health challenges. Now, that may not be the company necessarily providing the services themselves, but it could be everything from, mental health stipends or benefits of some kind to actually having an open dialogue about the issue to reduce stigmas around the issue. I know a lot of companies have brought in speakers that speak about the issue, have had senior leaders describe their own challenges to make it clear that this is something that all of us are experiencing. It's not that there's no a one person or individual that is disproportionately experiencing it. So I think a range of practices that we've seen companies do, everything from actual policies benefits to just more open dialogue around mental health challenges.
And that can be tough if you're not in an environment where your company's embracing that. Start with a conversation with your HR business partner or your HR team lead, and taking what Michaela said about measuring it. If you're experiencing it, your colleagues are experiencing it, but the company's not recognizing it, you could start with just a suggestion that we measure it. Can we take a poll? I know I'm feeling this. It might be helpful if we get our arms around it and encourage the HR team to support a survey, a poll, getting around how people are feeling and starting there.
I would definitely agree with that. First step, definitely talk to human resources, and they're learning and growing as well. I think that's an important thing. Nobody has ever gone through a pandemic before, and I think sometimes people are making the assumptions that their company's not doing anything. And some companies honestly need to have better communication and be much more vocal as far as what they're thinking or what their plans are. I think sometimes they think until a plan is 100% worked out, that they should kind of keep it to themselves. I think that employee communication is very, very important. We've tried all the way along to have company meetings and look for input, and we created a reopening committee so we could figure out how people are feeling about going back to offices, that type of thing. And that's all being driven by our human resources department. So I think that's a key first step. And on the flip side of that, I think these are the conversations where I've heard the term used several times, and I probably should have figured out where I could credit it to, but the Great Resignation. And I think, there are going to be companies out there that refuse this change or aren't hearing what their employees want. And I think over the next couple of years, were people willing to make a move in the middle of a pandemic? No. Most people are going to stay where they were and see how things played out. But I think you will see people over the next year to 2 years really think about, well, this is how my company reacted to the pandemic. I'm not sure this company aligns with my value structure and what I want out of my life and out of my career. And there's going to be companies out there that flourish because of this, because they've really taken the time to listen to their employees and be transformative in this difficult time. And people are going to flock to those companies because it's a great environment and people are going to want to work there.
That's a great point. And also to add, and I'll bring this up, something that we hear all the time when we speak to residents in the city of Boston and those who do call our office. And also is that feeling of not feeling comfortable, especially when it comes to addressing company policies because of fear of retaliation or even, do you guys have any advice specifically for that, for those who do feel that uncomfortableness and that feeling of retaliation, especially when it comes to working moms and actually expecting parents? How do you think this is something that can be addressed if the employer or the employee is feeling uncomfortable or have the feeling of that the company will have retaliation?
I mean, that's a very tough question because I think in each organization, it's very different. I mean, the one thing I would say is in terms of the job market right now is I think you have to ask and take that chance. And there are opportunities out there for folks right now that if they ask and the answer is not what they'd like to see, then, it might be time to come up with a strategy to move on and do something different.
Yeah, I think the two things I would add to what Maura just said is, one, there is a lot of research out there, right? So if you think about various strategies to influence, I think one certainly is just to point to the research. I think organization after organization, including us, we've seen this in surveys. This is not unique to a single company. We're seeing this across the board, challenges with managing multiple responsibilities and sense of isolation during the pandemic. I think secondly, I just want to go back to the point Maura had made a little while ago about company responses. So we did a survey last year about how companies have responded to the pandemic in terms of policies and practices. And I was incredibly surprised, but we surveyed about 1,000 companies across 10 different countries in the world. 9 out of 10 companies had put in place some policy or practice as a response to the pandemic, everything from flexibility to virtual work to stipends for employees. So I think it's important to recognize that companies are responding. I think in some instances, what the nature of that response is, as we've talked about, we're all still figuring out. So it is this grand experiment that we're all running. So, not speaking for a specific company, I would say, though, in general, the sentiment is one of let's experiment and let's see how we make this work effectively. So that's the good news. Now, I think that may not be true across all organizations, and there's still a lot of work to be done. That's the glass half full version of what I just said. But I think the glass half full version is that there is a lot of appetite for experimentation and trying to see what works.
That's very true. Thank you for that. Another question that came in from the audience is, do we have to do anything differently to close the gaps with women of color who left the workplace?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think we've seen disproportionately many kinds of impacts on women of color, whether it's leaving the workplace or challenges, as we've alluded to, while they're in the workplace itself. I think that the 2 or 3 things that are really important to talk about in this context is one around the kinds of challenges that women of color may be disproportionately experiencing. In general, our survey data would suggest that women of color are disproportionately affected by managing or having to manage household responsibilities and childcare responsibilities relative to white women. And so that is a specific, unique, acute challenge that women of color experience. And so therefore, the role of companies in recognizing that and potentially supporting that in some way, just the balancing of care and household responsibilities, I think becomes important. I think the second is thinking about specific industries that women of color tend to work in and what the recovery back for those industries looks like. And that may mean, for example, back to Nia's point, there may be certain roles that women of color are in that lend themselves to hybrid work, certain roles that lend themselves better to in-person work, and recognizing and segmenting that across an organization so you can put in place targeted responses, I think will become important.
And I can speak to it from the perspective of, if you haven't lost your women of color in the workplace, there are things you can do to retain them, right? Really, that's the focus at Verizon. And the pandemic has taught us to prioritize trust and empathy when we're supporting people in our workforce. And we emphasize fostering an equitable environment where employees do feel comfortable, we say it, but to really walk that out, where employees can bring their authentic whole selves to work. So Verizon's a big company, but we've managed to keep social justice and racial equity as part of our employee dialogue, in keeping with the experiences in our nation at large. And we do this in several ways. A couple I mentioned earlier, we have dedicated development programs and opportunities for women and for people of color. And we have our employee resource groups. But we've also published a racial and social justice action toolkit. It's available to the public on Verizon.com. And in there are tools and resources to get educated on social and racial disparities. Tools in there about how to evolve from advocate to ally to support communities of color in this country. Employees continue to engage in small group discussions on these themes. I've been part of many of these small group discussions, and it all fuels Verizon's purpose, which is, again, we want to create the networks that move the world forward for everyone. No one's left behind. We need to make sure we're being inclusive. And so I, as a woman of color, working mom, have benefited so much personally from the openness and the transparency of these dialogues. The fact that our senior leaders across the business are taking part of these dialogues, the fact that, again, we've made these resources available to anyone who's interested out in the world, and we stand for this as a company. And those are the types of actions and responses that would make, me never want to leave, right? Because I feel like I can bring my authentic, true self, and that I'm proud to be a Verizon employee, a V-teamer. And so we all live in a much more complex world where all of our intersectionalities matter. And the more empathic we can be, empathetic we can be with one another, maybe empathic, but empathetic for sure. The more we treat people with humanity, the better the outcomes are going to be.
It's also really interesting. Some of the surveys that I mentioned we've done, we surveyed employees and asked them what their expectations of employers was on diversity, equity, and inclusion topics, not just gender, but also as we think about racial equity, etc. Interestingly, employees are more and more demanding of employers that they play a role not just in advancing diversity and equity and inclusion within their four walls, but also outside of their four walls, whether that's in their communities, in their supply chains, as they think about their products and services. So again, from a business imperative standpoint, a focus on many of these issues that we've been talking about here is one that talent within organizations is demanding of their employers.
That is 100% true. I mean, as a Caucasian woman, I won't even pretend to understand the struggle, but I think from an overall employer perspective, I think it's important to listen and hear people. And it's not really something that stops within the company. It goes out to your networks and the vendors that you're working with and things like that, and something that you're living every day, not something that you talk about in a DEI meeting once a quarter or something like that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And such an important part of overall employee well-being is providing opportunities to give back to society. So, last year we launched our Citizen Verizon program, which is our responsible plan for economic, environmental, and social advancement. And we have lots of commitments around digital inclusion, preparing people for jobs of the future, supporting small businesses, and every employee has an opportunity to support all of those goals through our commitment to volunteer 2.5 million hours as a company by the year 2025. Also through our everyone's in on the action, and through our pro bono legal program, our lawyers also have opportunities to support social justice efforts, including assisting clients who faced eviction due to COVID-19, helping to expunge low-level criminal records, and supporting other civic and community engagement to address racial injustice in this country and around the world. So those are really meaningful ways that all of our employees can support giving back to society.
I'm calling it now. There has to be a part 2 to this conversation, and we must continue. There's so much more to talk about and so much more to address, but I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all the questions being asked by the audience, but I wanted to ask one more closing question for all to be able to answer. And in your opinion, is there a silver lining to this crisis? Has the pandemic shined a light on institutional and organization policies that need to be reformed or created in order to support working women? I'll open the floor, whoever wants to start.
I'd say yes. And I think everything we've talked about, from this opportunity to look at the integration of work and life in a different way, from the models of working, hybrid in the office, none of this was on the table in this serious, dedicated, and direct way before the pandemic. And similarly kind of tied in with the pandemic, as our nation has sort of exploded in terms of the discussions around racial and social justice and equity, bringing those into the workplace and allowing employees to discuss and to learn and to grow from one another. I mean, these have all been silver linings that I've experienced personally. And not to say that, we want a pandemic or these, these forces to happen outside in our community, but if we take those opportunities to all be better and to move forward, I'm glad to be a part of that.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. It's unfortunate that to drive change in such a drastic way that it took a worldwide health crisis, because I think, that piece of it was scary for a lot of people, and it was scary for businesses in the beginning too. But I don't believe that without something like that this change would have happened. I heard for years of people who wanted to work from home and they felt so shy about asking for a day a week and they had to be there 3 years or 5 years to even get that. Now I'm hopeful that employers see that trust in their employees is a very, very important thing, and that there are a lot of folks out there who are doing great things without being in an office, and that this can continue and we can really build a transformative culture going forward.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that was said. I think I'll just end with saying, I think it's also shown us we're capable of change at a pace that I don't think we would have imagined. So we've just transformed our working practices in a year. So think about if we did that every year going ahead. What world could we be in by 2025, 2030?
That's what we can be so far, right? And I'll just close with a couple of, I as everyone was speaking, I started jotting down themes and quotes and a lot of keywords that came up as everyone answered the question. So I'll end with a couple of words that resonate, and to me that summarize the conversation we had today. So flexibility, communication, change, policy, diversity, equity, listening, and change. And I'm pretty sure there's so many more that I missed, but those are just some words that popped and resonated to me as we were having this conversation. As we continue in our everyday lives and we continue moving forward, I really hope that this conversation shined a light on a lot of those who joined us today, specifically to talk about this important issue and to bring up that this is not just a conversation for today, right now. This is a conversation to have every single day. And I hope that our conversation here today encourage and shed that light to be able to have that conversation. And thank you to everyone who's here, and thank you to all of you for answering and just being with us today. And I'll be more than happy to pass it over to Celia.
Great, thank you all. And thank you, Alexandra, for moderating. It's not an easy task, so thank you. I think the one final thing I'll add before I wrap up is there was a question in the chat around stigma. Flexibility came up a lot in some of the recommendations you all made. But I think if I were to leave everyone with one tip, it's if your company is putting in place flexible workplace policies, it can't just be for women. It goes back to what Dr. Krishnan was saying, right? It's about people policies. So male leaders need to model that behavior too. So if there is flexibility, for men to take advantage of those benefits, to be at home, to do some of the caretaking, to take the time off is crucial. It can't just be the women taking those policies because it perpetuates it. So that's just the one final thing we'll end on. But thank you to all of you. Thank you so much to Liberty Mutual Insurance. The next program will be June 22nd at 10 o'clock on philanthropy. And we'll see you all then. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.